So I'd like to first welcome everyone. I am Bara Watts. I'm CEO for the Center for Food Innovation in Northeast Ohio. And you are here joining us for the webinar, Food Innovation in Northeast Ohio. Why here? Why now? This is the first webinar in our 6-part series held on consecutive Thursdays from 4 to 5 Eastern Standard Time. This is a webinar, which means that only the panelists have open mics and video. We're asking that that everybody, when they come in, please share your name and what you're hoping to learn from the webinar, so that others who are joining in as attendees can see who else is joining us. You can adjust, you can adjust if you want to talk directly to one of the audience members or directly to the panelists. All right, so the Center for Food Innovation, in partnership with Lorain County Community College, is hosting this 6-part series. Our intention is to inspire a discussion and actions focused on advanced agriculture and food industry development as an economic development opportunity for the region, supporting local farms, supporting business growth, propelling entrepreneurial startups, and increasing job growth across a range of industries. The Center for Food Innovation is a very new organization. We got our 501c3 earlier this year, funded through the Nord Foundation, a foundation in Lorain County. And we are developed on the model of Food Valley out of the Netherlands. In the Food Valley, they created a nonprofit that became an innovation bridge that connected up a number of different industry sectors to create a food cluster. And by so doing, within a 15-year period from 2005 to 2020, they became the second largest agricultural exporter in the world, next to the United States. They predominantly moved food into their tangential countries around them, but then they also exported technology, which was a significant piece of that export volume, to countries around the world for food production in all forms and fashions, which is becoming increasingly more important as we start facing the climate conditions that are already beginning to ripple through the various different areas of the globe. The Center for Food Innovation here in Northeast Ohio is tasked with connecting and facilitating a cluster-wide system of industries and organizations that can develop a full lattice system that enables existing businesses to grow and be more successful, and supporting startups because they're able to start seeing where the gaps are between the existing businesses as we start growing the entire industry cluster. Food is the nexus. It is the center point, the focus around which we are working. But against that, we are connecting up higher ed, both from the research levels down to the workforce development. We are working to bring in industries, the Eatons and the others that are working in robotics and sensors and water and IoT. This is a whole area of industry that is ripe for them to participate in. Working with farmers, both on the local seasonal to year-round farming capabilities, to funders, both our public funding entities all the way through to private entities. This is about building an entire cluster around which we as in Northeast Ohio can grow our economic prosperity. The beauty of this is that we live in a unique area. It is here where we have both the deep knowledge and expertise in the farming community, and we've got the high-tech industry players. And by bringing them all together, we have the potential to create a truly unique economic opportunity. Just this past week, I was at a groundbreaking in the city of Cleveland along the new Opportunity Corridor, where they did a groundbreaking for a cold storage facility right across the street from Orlando bread baking company, an example of some of the technology and companies that are starting to see this as an opportunity. And hopefully through our combined efforts, we're going to be able to really accelerate that opportunity for the region. Part of the impetus for our growth and for our focus here was research that was done a number of years ago called a report called the 25% Shift. It is a report funded by the Cleveland Foundation, the Neighborhood Progress, Inc., the Cleveland Cuyahoga County Food Policy Commission, and Kent State University. It found that if we were to increase food production from its current about 5% of demand to 25% of demand, we could increase jobs significantly, generate $4.2 billion in annual regional output, and produce up to $126 million in annual state and local taxes. Now, this report was written in 2010. That's 12 years ago. What can increased food production do in today's economy? By increasing food production, we have the potential to spur increases in food manufacturing. They're going to want to move closer to where we are actually producing greater quantities of food. Processing and distribution has the potential to get to increase. Right now, food processing is one of the largest food categories in Northeast Ohio from a GDP perspective, and could be a huge piece that we could be building upon. And it increases, then we've also got the opportunity to grow jobs in warehousing and all the ancillary technology companies that would be supporting these industries. So with more food production, particularly in year-round controlled environment agriculture, we can spur growth in IoT, robotics, sensors, LED lighting, and water systems. So the conversation today, we're going to be starting with our two renowned researchers who are here to talk about some of the information that they can share about Northeast Ohio and the national movement in food technology and agri-tech. I would like to make sure that you also, if you've not done so, please sign up for the whole series. The series includes this one, which is really talking about what is the economic potential. The second webinar is the demand for local food production. Third is how to meet the demand for local production and meat. And I should say in the demand, we're going to have Jeff Heinens, we're going to have representatives from Bon Appetit. In the webinar for how to meet demand, we're going to have leading farmers from cattle to our vertical farms, talking about what they're doing, what their challenges are, and the opportunities that are presented. Then we will have a leading innovation, an author talking about the food from technologies that are changing our whole food systems. Then the money looking to support this growth. And then finally, at our final webinar program will be, we will have Marcy Capter and Tim Derrickson, who is Director of Food, Agriculture, and Agribusiness for Jobs Ohio. And a number of other leading authorities in the Ohio market to talk about what the kind of enthusiasm and support is available as we start moving forward with our programs. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our speakers. Our first speaker will be Hans Reinsch, and he is intelligence analyst at Aimpoint Research. Hans is an active sixth-generation Iowa farmer. He graduated from Iowa State University with a degree in agricultural business and international agriculture. Hans has worked on a variety of farms across the country for BASF in Germany and for the Chinese Academy of Agricultural Sciences in Beijing. He is an alumni of the Bayer Youth Ag Summit and has been active in the World Food Prize Foundation and is a mentor to the Generator Ag Tech Accelerator, helping a variety of ag companies conduct research on his family farm. He will be our first speaker. Can you please welcome Hans Reinsch?
Wow, I don't know how to follow that introduction. That was far too kind. But it's great to talk to you all this afternoon. My name is Hans Reinsch from northeastern Iowa, and grew up on our family's farming operation and started out here with Aimpoint Research. And so today, what I really want to bring us to start talking about is the state of the Ohio food system, and then putting that into context to talk about where we are now so that we can really begin to analyze what changing this food system means and how we can actually do that. So let me know if my screen looks like it should. Is my slide across there?
Mhm.
Fantastic. So what we're going to glance over today here is going to be talking about some of the fundamentals of food systems, the history of the current food system that we have now, both in the US, but with an Ohio focus, and then talk about some of the evolving consumer demands that we're seeing being put on our food system and some of the ways that ag is responding. And then finally, we're going to wrap it up with what is the role of local foods in this ever-changing agricultural system. So let's start with the conventional wisdom, which is humans have been farming for thousands of years. Everything that we use in our agricultural systems is the culmination of the best practices that we have discovered and retained so far. Not necessarily does it mean that we have reached the apex and we cannot continue to improve. And when we look at food systems as a whole, we notice that we see that they are a multi-tiered, complex environment that has a lot of facets we have to take into account. And that usually when we think about food security and food systems, we tend to think large scale as a world. That's what we hear about in the news. It's what we're hearing about with Ukraine right now. However, a global food system doesn't work without layers and layers of successful food systems below it. If a person is not food secure, they can't contribute to their local food system. And that the work that they do trickles up to inevitably make the globe a place that is habitable for a large population. And that means that these local food systems, and we'll circle back to this, are the key. They are the shoulders on which we build greater food systems like that which we currently have in the world today. But to talk about the local food system and to talk about it here in Ohio, there's no level of tribute we could possibly give that would do justice. But if we're going to talk about our current food system, let's take a moment to talk about how this is not the first food system which has existed in Ohio, and that there was a food system before what we see now today. And that we are indebted to the people who came before us on this land because they brought us many of the crops that we depend on today, that without their hard work and the systems that they employed, their local production and their regional trade of crops like corn and tomatoes and potatoes and things that we depend on, that we couldn't build the system that we have now. And that system that we currently have looks a little bit like this over time. It's built on three key pillars, and those three key pillars are food systems start with subsistence, and then they work towards stability, and then they finally end up with security. So the history of the Ohio food system starts with the settling of what was then the Northwest Territories. The land was opened up for homesteading. 90% of the population of the US farmed at this time, and everyone was a part of a very hyper-local food system. You survived on what you had and what you grew, and this was going to be the limits of what you had available to you. But over time, as the nation developed, we began to start to see local food systems develop. Technologies, things like the steel plow that we take for granted today. This is actually the last year that John Deere is going to make the steel plow. That these sorts of technologies, as simple and rudimentary as they might be, were the foundations that allowed people who were subsistence farmers to begin to build cities and towns, and people could get away to be doctors and teachers and artists. I mean, we had small communities that enabled some level of food security, but they were still at risk of acute hunger. After the Civil War, there was a great push for infrastructure across most of the developing West of the United States then. There were advancements in river and railroad technology. The first fertilizers were beginning to be imported and used across this region that we now know as Ohio. A lot of guano coming from South America. And we began to see that as infrastructure enabled food systems to spread out, it began to diversify not only the foods that people could add in their diets, a region which could grow apples could trade with one that could grow potatoes, but it also diversified the production risks. If some counties would have a crop failure, they could trade food back and forth with some that had a surplus. And so we started to see this diminishing of local food systems as in a push towards a wider spread food system. And this widespread food system became global very quickly when it came to the events in Europe in the early 1900s with the World War I, when Europe suddenly basically stopped producing their own crops. The United States began to be the people who were able to supply that food to them. But however, policy in agriculture became irrevocably intertwined at this time with price guarantees for grain and encouraging producers to expand to meet this massive demand push. And these spilled over throughout the Great Depression and encouraged farmers to farm lands that were more marginal, pushing us towards the Dust Bowl. And a lot of this was rectified as part of the New Deal programs. But all of these programs were put in place for the sake of stability, that you would be able to produce enough that your own people would be protected. And the same cycle occurred after the Second World War. But the food system pushed out even further into security after the Second World War. Much of the facilities that were once used to produce goods for the war, maybe like nitrogen facilities, began to be turned around and used for fertilizer. There was a mission to eradicate hunger across the nation because so many people had been turned away from going to the draft because they were malnourished in rural America. And we saw that these sorts of pushes and drives encouraged the specialization of farms to no longer be as diversified as they once were. And then finally, we enter an era of globalization, where a very intertwined globalization. Whereas we were always somewhat globalized, this was the first time that America really stepped forward as being a unified leader in the agricultural export markets. And we saw that the Green Revolution brought forward higher yields, and nations became very dependent upon each other for their food supply, which leads us to where Ohio is today. Ohio right now is the 14th largest producer of food, or of agricultural commodities by value in the United States. It's 13.5 million acres of ag land. However, much of this, and just to the point Barra made earlier, is that much of this was not locally consumed food. That 38% of the value of goods in 2017, the last year with a census record on it, this was meant for export. And that the demographics of farmers in this region continue to shift, and that there are fewer young people coming back, and there's less opportunity in this consolidating market, which doesn't really look as much internally. And if we step back and we just take the story where it is now, it would seem as though it was a massive success, and that the current food system has delivered a radical ability for us to go ahead and change our food system by being able to provide for ever-growing masses of people. And we have seen fewer wars related to food supplies, and that at a surface level, it seems that we have succeeded. But there might be more to the story, because this food system, which we are presently dependent on, as good as it is, has a couple consequences. And these are not things that were ill-intended, but are just what we found along the way of trying to push ourselves further as a civilization. And what we see is, although we have made great strides in fighting hunger, and states like Ohio contribute to fighting this globally, we see rises in obesity. And we see that food, although it's available, is not always affordable or equitably distributed, and that there are mechanisms that need to go in place in order to let consumers even have access to food which is healthier for them. And when it comes to what food is truly healthy for them, we have to ask whether our current food system truly delivers things that are as healthy for us as we might believe them to be. Research has come out that shows that 67% of the calories that children and adolescents take in come from ultra-processed foods. We look at the results of our current food system, not ill-intended, but we see rises in dietary linked diseases and deaths according to those causes. And so what we end up having is that the changing base of consumers recognizing these trends is beginning to ask different things of a food system. And we see this especially among younger consumers. When we look at millennials and Gen Z and we maintain a consumer tracker taking pulses of a snapshot of a balanced view of the United States every few months, we notice that these generations are thinking about things like environmentally friendly packaging and sustainability and also health more often than generations before them ever maybe considered. And as their priorities change, they begin to ask different things of the food system. And what we see coming to the top out of this food system that they want to attain is improved nutrition. They want enhanced plant characteristics. They want access to maybe molecules or things that they did not know that could enhance their health at some time. And now that they know of it, they want to seek them out. They're looking for people to add greater nutrition to much of the food that we already get on our shelves now, and people are reacting, and the logos here are people who are working to fill these needs. We also see that consumers are asking for climate accountability, that consumers recognize that not only do they want not only do they want the industry to improve its impact in the world and its footprint, but they also want it for themselves. They want the ability to make the decision and to pursue foods that are healthy for both them and the environment. And they also want transparency within the food system. And when we track this, we notice that this is especially coming with younger generations who are even further from the farm, and that people want transparency because what drives their decisions more often than a book of facts is their trust in the shared values a producer has. And if they can see back to why you produced and how you produced, they will have a reason to actually connect and believe what you might say about your products. So if the global food system needs to evolve, that's fine. Let's just go to the top of the food chain, the top of the new food pyramid with global food security on the top of it, and let's just make some changes. However, this hasn't been as successful as was hoped. Just last year, Sri Lanka came forward looking to revolutionize their food system, and they decided to ban the imports of fertilizers and agrochemicals to meet consumer interests. However, farms realized that this could be a problem for them. People saw a food crisis on the horizon. People began to eat less. People began to worry and starve, and now there's a crisis ongoing in Sri Lanka, and they're trying to work to retroactively correct what was initially a top-down initiative to change food. The nation is spiraling into a form of economic decline, and right now, a lot of people within the nation are looking to leave Sri Lanka in pursuit of places that simply have access to food. We realize that this is not the way that we could drive change in our food systems, but let's flip it on its head. Because local food systems are how we have the ability to drive global change. And that what we see is, yeah, the global food system right now is still focused on subsistence, sustainability, and security, because it can't afford to take risks on its own. It can't afford to try and revolutionize itself without putting people at jeopardy. However, we see that historically, in times of peace, we've seen that it's been the consumer-focused local food systems that have been the best channels to drive change in the global food system. That if you don't have World War II knocking at your doorstep to help drive your fertilizer demand up or production up after the war, what really matters is back to the basics of all time, which is that everything that we now currently see in our globalized food system started as someone's local practice and local initiative. And as this trickles up, we see that these local initiatives have the ability to spread and be the grassroots from which we actually shift our food system to meet just some of those consumer demands like nutritional outcomes, climate accountability, and transparency. And that this is going to highlight why initiatives like this are so critical, because putting this mission, even though it's currently just seems local, this could be truly the building blocks of what we see in our agricultural future 10, 15 years from now. So the key themes I want to cover before we wrap up here is that the current global food system was built off of the success of local food systems. Had there not been successful systems, we could not have afforded to take the risks to build what we have now. And that as the next generation of consumers want changes and they want the global food system to adapt, it will really be the local actors who drive this change and make it attainable. And the last thing is that it really does fall on their shoulders, because any initiative much higher up than the local food system is not likely to make a sustainable change. It may make a temporary change, but with the whims of policy, this can be undone very quickly. But strength comes from those sorts of grassroots initiatives. So on the answering of why Ohio and why now, as we look forward to the challenges that come up on our global food system, as we look to feed an expanding population with limited resources, it's why here because of the resources that Barra just highlighted, and why now because we don't have time. But what we do have is excellent people and excellent resources in the capacities that will allow us to make changes on a global footprint starting here in Northeast Ohio.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you. That was awesome, Hans. Hans, that was so awesome. I've got so much out of that. That was amazing. So I want to encourage everyone who is participating, as our speakers are sharing their presentations, please put any of your thoughts and questions into the chat. At the end of Casey's talk, Madison will be facilitating questions and answers. And addressing any of your thoughts that you can put into the chat. So our next speaker I would like to introduce is Casey Hoy. Casey Hoy is retired professor emeritus and former associate director of the Department of Entomology at The Ohio State University. Casey held the Kellogg Endowed Chair in Agricultural Ecosystems Management and provided leadership to the Agroecosystems Management Program of the Ohio Agriculture Research and Development Center from 2006 to 2021. And I should note that it's one of the top, if not the top, agriculture research centers in the country. Hoy's past research has included systems analysis and its application to integrated pest management and applied agricultural ecology, and he led interdisciplinary research toward advancements in agrosystems health and sustainable communities. Please welcome Casey Hoy.
Thanks, Barra. Thanks for the invitation. As Barra mentioned, I'm retired, so I'm not doing this quite as often as I used to, but it's a pleasure, and I am still passionate about the questions. Hans and I coordinated our messages for all of about 3 minutes, about 25 minutes ago, but I think you'll see a lot of complementarity in what we're talking about, and also the way we're going about it, with perhaps some different areas that we're drilling down into. So I will share and start. And I probably need to swap screens, don't I? Do I need to swap displays?
No, you're good.
You're good. Okay, great. So what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about history, but as well as Hans, and then talk about what I see as some of the untapped potential in Northeast Ohio. When I go to history, I'm going to go back just a little bit farther than Hans did, maybe about 1.8 million years. So that's the last time that Ohio was heavily glaciated. This was the Pleistocene era. The shaded region was where the glaciers reached, and the white areas where it was unglaciated. And what those glaciers did was essentially bulldozed ancient river systems that used to come up from the southern Appalachians through Ohio and then back down what's now the Mississippi, and filled in those deep river valleys with very rich glacial till, and rearranged the drainage to what's now the Ohio River. And when I say rich, I mean rich in a couple different ways. So keep your eye on that line between the shaded and the unshaded area. This is the map of glaciation. That's median household income in 1999. So if there's any question about whether our wealth, a lot of it comes from our soils, this should help answer that question. So it's a very rich state agriculturally. It's very rich ecologically. This is the Gordon Vegetation Index. Don't even try to read that legend. The point here is that we have a really diverse array of natural plant communities in Ohio. We straddle 4 EPA large ecological regions. So we have a very rich state ecologically as well. So now fast forward from the Pleistocene, and I'm going to skip right past the Native American period, the thousands of years that Native people lived in Ohio, lived very well, had a sustainable food system. If you're around for thousands of years and existing well, you can start talking about sustainability. We've only been around for a couple hundred as European arrivals, so we don't get to talk about that quite yet. Those native tribes, when Europeans arrived, were much healthier and much more food secure. So I don't think we want to minimize that. But fast forwarding to European arrival, these folks were not as familiar with the land. They weren't necessarily the most astute ecologists. So early on, they thought that the prairies were worthless because you couldn't even grow trees there. They eventually figured that one out. But they fairly quickly figured out that these river valleys were great places to grow corn. So right at the beginning of the timeline that Hans shared, you had European settlers coming in and figuring out you can grow corn really well in these river valleys. This is a Scioto River here, that's Columbus. There's also a number of other valleys where you can see places where corn will grow well. The problem is, early 1800s, what are you going to do with corn on the frontier? There aren't very many people around. There's maybe 2 military garrisons on the Ohio River. Not much you can do with it. But everybody else there is growing corn. You don't have dryers. You can't ship it. It'll sprout on you in a couple of weeks if you try. So what do? Well, you can give it legs. So a guy named William Renwick figured out in 1813 that you can make a tidy profit by packing corn into cows. So he essentially had a CAFO in Coshocton, about 1,500 head of cattle that he was corn finishing, and then found that he could march them over the mountains to Baltimore and sell the beef on the international market. You can also, and the students usually get this one first, take the corn and distill it into alcohol. So the frontier was dotted with stills, and it wasn't because it was party time on the frontier. It's because that's a way that you could take corn and turn it into something valuable that you could ship. So they would put the whiskey into barrels, put them on flatboats, ship it down to Ohio, and sell it on the international market out of New Orleans. You could also take the distiller's grains and feed them to hogs. So Cincinnati, before 1820, was already known as Porkopolis. It had about 2 distilleries and 9 breweries, all of them ringed with kind of free-ranging hogs eating the distiller's grains. And then they'd chop up the hogs and add salt, put those in barrels, and send the salt pork down the Ohio and Mississippi and sell it on the international market. So by 1820, we're growing a lot of corn, we're turning it into alcohol, we're producing animal products, and we're selling it on the global market. Fast forward to now, and here's the National Crop Data Layer image of Ohio from space. And despite all of that ecological diversity and the ability to grow everything that's on this long legend, you're seeing 5 things in this picture. That's corn and beans on the upper left, and grass and trees on the lower right, and the gray splotches are places where people are living. So fast forward to now, we're growing a lot of corn. We've added 1 crop, soybeans. We're turning it into ethanol for transportation fuel. We're producing a lot of animal products, and we're selling it on the global market. Doesn't seem like we've changed a whole lot in about 200 years. And meanwhile, there actually are some people around that you could sell stuff to now. That wasn't true in 1800. It's very true now. I remember Doug Brown, who was with Secretary Vilsack and an assistant to Kathleen Merrigan, saying, if you can't do local food systems in Ohio, where are you going to do it? Good state for it. And there are a lot of reasons to do it. One thing about this commodity productions of grain, and I think Hans and his family would be familiar with this, we, as a society, put farmers in a really difficult position. So the amount that we spend on food doesn't change much over time, but the cost of all the inputs and the cost of what's added beyond the farm gate keeps increasing. So we're constantly putting farmers in a tighter and tighter economic squeeze to produce more with the for the amount that they're spending. And that's behind these trends in farm consolidation. So it's a really tough business to be in farming. That large scale isn't the only option. A few years ago, about a decade ago, I was working with the Fund for Our Economic Future and in a project that was also funded by the USDA Specialty Crops Initiative on looking at the agricultural biosciences industry cluster and finding ways to stimulate economic activity in that cluster in northern Ohio. And that led to a study that was done by Bush Consulting, where they looked at how do we define the agricultural biosciences cluster, for one thing, because it's not just corn and livestock. It's a very large array of different kind of crops and value-added products. So they helped flesh out, what is this cluster about? And what they found was in both employment, the total number of people that could be employed, and the total kind of revenues that are available through development in this cluster, it was much bigger than any of these other things that they were kind of gaga over at the time. These advanced electronics and sensor systems, industrial water, advanced energy. The agricultural biosciences was much larger than any of those as an economic opportunity. And it fell into two pieces. For the FTEs, it was about half and half opportunity in export-oriented production, which could include things like hardwood furniture, as well as food processing and packaging, as well as industrial products like biopolymers and the like that we can take from agricultural produce. But then the other side was import substitution. Us producing what currently 95% of is coming from somewhere else and producing it and selling it within Ohio. And there's a wide range of array of things there. And that's, about a 60-40 split in terms of the revenues that are possible. Economic development is a lot more used to the kind of development that takes place in this export-oriented side of the cluster, not quite as much in the import substitution side, despite this being not news to a lot of people. So Mary Holmes, who originally asked me to give this talk, had done a special report on entrepreneurial farming and all the great kinds of very creative things that farmers were doing at a range of scales in Northeast Ohio. And again, this was at least 15 years ago that Mary produced this product. Sometimes people worry, well, if people are doing this kind of farming, we're not going to produce as much, and world food security is a big issue, and we feed the world. Well, A, the data isn't so good for we feed the world. We actually don't. But B, you actually can produce a lot this way, and the native peoples that were here first knew that. I had a student named Liz Colby who did some work where she was combining kind of a design and scientific modeling study. So she first designed 3 different scales of production. So this is kind of large garden, 50 by 100 or so, and how you would manage that over the course of the year. This is the 10 to 13 acre small farm that we're seeing lots more of in Northeast Ohio. And this is about 90 acres, which is about the average farm size in Ohio. So this is more mechanized, more hand labor as you go this way, but all of them, if you apply ecological principles and add a fair amount of diversity, both in space and over time, what could you produce if you kind of painted in northern Ohio, Northeast Ohio with that design? So she applied those designs wherever there was enough space to do it. And this was on agricultural land any kind of large areas of turf grass, including residential or large commercial areas, not getting into cemeteries or football fields or anything like that, not cutting down forests. So just take these designs and place them where you could actually conveniently place agriculture in Northeast Ohio. And then what would it produce? The urban areas, Cleveland, Akron, Canton, Youngstown, were obviously places where that smallest design fit the most frequently. You get out into the rural areas and that larger scale design fit well. And then in between, you had a lot of these areas that are kind of red in this map where that medium scale design, the 10 to 13 acres, fit very well. But once you looked at what you would produce, if you were producing this way in Northeast Ohio, it was much more in the blue than what we're currently producing, which is in the red. And that's because all of these designs are much more diverse, both spatially and temporally. So you're able to produce, use 3 different sets of yield data, and by any of them, you are producing a whole lot more than we're currently producing. So it's a good idea. You can produce more. There are people to sell it to. What's holding us back? So one of Hans's questions, why aren't we doing? So here's that global set of supply chains. It's kind of flipped from the pyramid that Hans showed, but it goes everywhere from just going straight to a farm, buying direct from a farmer, to this global system that involves planes and ships and trains and a lot of steps from point of origin to where we're purchasing it. This part, the one on the bottom, is really well developed and well capitalized, and there's been a lot of investment. But you really do need all of these functioning, because if there's a glitch somewhere, you want to be able to shift to another scale quickly. During the pandemic, we saw a number of instances where that global chain got interrupted, and it wasn't pretty. So that's where you had some really perverse outcomes, like thousands of gallons of milk being dumped, entire herds of animals being slaughtered and composted because that supply chain wasn't working and the other supply chains weren't developed well enough to shift. So we do not have a particularly resilient system, and the pandemic showed us that. But in my experience, what holds us back in developing this further is that everybody's kind of waiting for somebody else to make the first move. So let's look at this kind of intermediate scale. You could try to pump up the production side and really invest in getting more production going. If there's no way to get it to market and there's no demand at the market that's going to take care of that, it makes no economic sense for producers to suddenly start producing a lot. Okay, well, you could do the middle. You could put in a food hub. The issue is if you put in the food hub and you don't have the production on one side and the place to sell it on the other side, the food hub is not going to last very long. It's in a very tough economic position. You could try to add more retail capacity to create a pull. Well, if you don't have the supply chain behind it, again, it's a very tough way to go. Local Roots here in Worcester actually did this. They increased shelf space for local products. The first thing they heard from our local businessmen is, you don't have your supply chain figured out. And they were right, but Local Roots knew they had enough social capital that they could tough it out over the time. And it's still developing, but it's been a tough haul, I think, if you talk to anybody at Local Roots. It's working, but it's taking time. So what you really need is for all of this to be happening at once. What we have right now is somebody will make a tiny little move and everybody else will adjust. And then somebody makes a tiny move and everybody adjusts. So you have this very slow ratcheting. You need it all to be kind of taking place at once and in much bigger steps. And that was the thinking behind this website that we put together when we were working with the Fund for Our Economic Future and the USDA Specialty Crops Initiative. Localfoodsystems.org is the URL. Yeah, we got it. We were in first. Go figure. So it's easy to remember. But the idea behind this site is people planning businesses on these local and regional supply chains can start planning in cahoots, figure out what other people are doing, and plan supply chains instead of pieces of non-existent chains. So there's a way for those entrepreneurs to connect and get together on what their plans are. We found in the first few years of this is snapshots of the activity on that website. The dots are individuals that are getting involved, where you have people starting to communicate back and forth on the site. They kind of come towards the center and there are lines between them. So you can see that's growing. There's this knot of interactions that are beginning to take place. A heck of a lot of people sitting around the sidelines watching it all. So that led to a development of the site that we have now, which involves a section for people who just want to network and share their thoughts about food systems, which is great. They could be investors. There's a part of the site that's specifically for the entrepreneurs to launch their business case and get it connected and plan on supply chain levels. And then finally, a spot for economic developers, because this is their job, to help those entrepreneurs get connected and develop at a supply chain scale. One example of the kind of thing that would develop as a result of this, and this was a case that was actually building at one point. This is a dairy farm up in Northeast Ohio. That's not the swimming pool. That's called the lagoon. The dairy farmer needed a management plan for what was in the lagoon, and his idea was a biodigester. This is the one that's at OARDC here in Worcester. That would take the manure, and if you add other things like food waste, produces methane gas and heat. So this guy's a dairy farmer. He's got dairy cows. He's got plenty of heat and plenty of methane. He doesn't care about what's coming out of this thing. He just wants a place to put the manure in. But there was a small vegetable producer down the road who had a good use for the heat and methane. He would use that for a greenhouse, produce more produce year-round. He already had a contract with the local school system to purchase the produce, and then they were willing to collect the food waste and send it back to the biodigester. So this is the kind of industrial ecology, tighter cycling of one business's output becomes the next business's input that we're looking for, and the kind of thing that builds that value in a local economy where there's mutual support for farms, for neighboring communities, and much tighter cycling and less leakage of energy and waste across agricultural systems. This is what the site looks like when I log in. So that snapshot was taken last night. These are projects that I've been involved with. This is local roots around Worcester. There's a group over in Mansfield. Columbus, we had a project down in Athens. Oberlin's up here, Lorain County Community College. The dots are all either businesses or business cases or supporting organizations like Lorain County Community College, OARDC, and so on. The blue lines are suggested connections. Like if you started planning to work together, you could develop this supply chain. The red lines are where people have accepted that suggestion, and they're either currently doing business that way or working on actually making that supply chain link happen. So that's the idea that we're trying to develop. Now, there's a couple of different ways that we can support this. One is this kind of helping people get connected, and I think that's a good role for FCI, and get connected at local and regional kind of shifting scales across the landscape. There's also supporting the development of the business, thinking about it at those landscape scales. So one resource that you should take a look at if you haven't seen it yet is this study that was done a couple of years ago called, it was kind of facilitated by Solutions from the Land, funded by the Kellogg Foundation. We got together leaders from the agricultural community across Ohio, and this was everything from the very smallest scale urban producers to some of the largest scale producers in the state, but specifically looking for the leaders and the thinkers in the agricultural community. And what we hit them with was, you say you feed the world, 1 in 6 households in Ohio are food insecure. What's your solution? You know, you're stewards of the land, and yet we do have algal blooms taken off in Lake Erie. What's your answer? You claim that people don't listen. We're listening. Let's put it, we'll make sure that people have a reason to listen. So that's what's in this report. It ends with 50 recommendations, and they're really good ideas that came from the agricultural community. So I'd highly recommend getting a copy of that, and I've got the web address up there. The other one that is important, what we found is, you know, you can do all the planning, you can have these great ideas for what people should do until they actually have the capital to do it. it's just a lot of planning. One of the recommendations in here was development finance applied to food and agriculture. And that's something that the Council of Development Finance Agencies has taken on. We're fortunate in that this national organization is located in Columbus. The executive director, Toby Rittner, happens to be an adjunct professor at Ohio State. And the staff are very bright, recent graduates, a lot of them from city and regional planning. So they have a great resource center for food systems finance, a series of white papers, webinars. They're coming up with a comprehensive guide. Our former program manager with the Initiative for Food and Agricultural Transformation at Ohio State is working on this project, and she can help with future webinars if you're interested in a presentation on this. But I'd highly recommend you take a look at this food systems finance and the opportunities for really propelling development at those local and regional scales forward. So I think that's a good spot to move on to questions and discussion.
Yes.
Casey, thank you so much. That was awesome. And yes, it was totally complimentary. And I hope that all those who are on are seeing how to literally make upon how fertile this opportunity is for all of us here in Ohio and Northeast Ohio in particular. The diversity of food production capabilities and the interest in trying to make this thing happen at a local level and reaching across all the different resources that we have already here in the region and in the state. I know we've got a number of questions that have been coming in. I'd like to lob this over to Madison to ask the questions.
Sure. First question is from Brett. In what proactive ways can strategies to transition to more local food be aligned with strategies to transition to more nutritious and equitably distributed food? And that's for either one of you.
I'll take the first crack at it. I think if you want to work on having food be equitably distributed, you really have to begin involving the people that you want that food to go to in the process of growing and developing, even giving them a space to put input into what that food is. Because if it's going to be for them, they should have an influence in it. They should have a space and a say in it, because that's absolutely critical to making it be an equitable distribution system.
I guess my answer would be, people are food insecure either because they don't have the resources to purchase food or they don't have the resources to produce it themselves. So you're into issues of poverty and land reform. And the land is held by a very small percentage of the population, land that's productive. Wealth inequity is pretty high in the country right now. So those are even bigger challenges than we're talking about with developing local economies, but I think it is something that you really do have to pay attention to if you want to achieve equitable food security.
Great. All right, our next question. What role will moving from a centralized to a decentralized agriculture have on the national food system?
That's a great one, because I think that the last 2 years have highlighted that more so than anything, and that being fully dependent upon a globalized or nationalized food system, we've seen where that supply chain has broken down and there has been no fallback, and there's been no plan or even seed water to grow into that space that's been created. And so working to create a decentralized food system enables resilience for a variety of communities across the country. And it is much more along the lines of where we should be going with our food system than where we have been in the past, as we look to just simply look at security with the metrics we had before.
Yeah, I think Hans has nailed it. The resilience requires the diversity that you get from a decentralized system. So if you want a resilient system, which we really do and really need, especially with climate change coming on and causing even greater disruptions than we've seen with the pandemic, we do need that. I will say that, you know, there's a reason we have the centralized system as well, that if under expected conditions, it can be very efficient. Under expected conditions, which include policy and the way people invest and monetary systems and things like that, it can be very economically efficient. So I would say if we're going to continue to invest in that centralized systems, and there are good reasons to do it, we need to pay attention more than just the economic efficiency, and also look at the kinds of social justice questions that Brett raised in the first place.
We're up to getting close to the end here, so I think maybe one more question. If you could pull another question, Madison.
Sure, absolutely. Pick just one. I like this one from Rebecca. It's for Hans. Amazing how we've gone from 90% of the population to about 2% farming today. Nevertheless, based on your research, what do you see as key challenges to growth in local foods? What areas and locations have you seen doing well with local production?
So where we see regions that have done well with local production, say, it's oftentimes been the people who've never moved away from it. So I had spent some time working in some very rural regions of China, and you see that these areas are hyper locally focused, and they produce what they need where they have it. But what the challenge is that I foresee coming to extending local foods across the United States is in a lot of the regions where local foods are still the default, labor is still very widely available or willing to be put to that sort of work. And one of the reasons why we push towards a more centralized and more aggregated food supply chain is the availability of labor. And that, I mean, entire economies build part of their level of development. One of the metrics is what percentage of your people are in agriculture. And the fewer it is, the more developed you are in this thinking. And so it's kind of a tough thing to try and get people to want to come back in and do that work. But when you find passionate people who are willing to do it, it can be phenomenal.
Wonderful. Well, we are at the hour here. I want to thank both Casey and Hans very much, and thank you to our diverse audience. This is a collaborative process nonetheless. Please join us next week, same time, different Zoom link. Also note the Center for Food Innovation and Lorain County Community College will be holding a 6-week startup boot camp later this year focused on greenhouse business development and food commercialization businesses. And it will be developed through a satellite program with Lorain County Community College in Elyria, their offices down in Wellington, and in partnership with Britton Bell Carr, a community development corporation in the city of Cleveland. We want to remind everybody to please look out for the email from this following this webinar. It'll have a link to the video. Please share it with all of your friends, families, colleagues. And a person who has been here on the live program will be selected to receive a copy of the book Tech to Table, written by Richard Munson. We will be offering one book per webinar to one of our participants joining us. And we want to thank our promotional sponsors, which is the Ohio Farm Bureau, Oberlin Business Partnership, the Lorain Chamber of Commerce, Jumpstart, Britton Bell Carr, and very specially Glide and Lorain County Community College, all of which are helping us to get the word out and to support these programs. That is it for tonight. Please share this program with all your friends, family, and colleagues you feel will have interest. We look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you.